Okay, here we go, typographic anatomy. Learning the lexicon. The very first thing is the baseline. All type sits on a baseline. The next line in our scaffolding is the median. So between the baseline and the median line is the lowercase letter forms, which also equal the X height. Notice how the rounded letters go above and below the baseline and the median line. But if we notice the I and the N, straight parts of the N anyway, do not. Can anyone tell me why the curved letters go above and below and don't sit directly on the line?
Because they're curved?
Right. What would happen if we had the curve sit on that line?
You'd either have to shrink the letter or it'd be going too far above the median.
You would have to shrink the letter, and therefore the letter would feel smaller than the rest of the letters in the word. And so what's happening is you have to have the letters be a little larger that go above and below the line. And the reason is that you have to have more of the black of the letter form, because optically you would be missing, you would see these letters as smaller than the rest of the letters if they were sitting between the two lines. They have to go a little larger because optically then they feel like they're the same size, even though they're slightly larger. So just keep that in mind. They're always a little larger. So cap height is the next line. Cap height takes us to the capital letters. I want you to notice there are 3 examples here and of 3 different typefaces. These 3 different typefaces are all the same size, yet their heights are different. So I want you to keep that in mind. We're going to be talking about measurements shortly, but recognizing that we don't measure typefaces by the height of the letter form. These are all the same size, point size, yet they are not all the same height. So we measure with points and picas when we're dealing with type. We are going to be looking at, you already know points because you guys have been using computers, and computers have already taught you that all typefaces are in a point size. 6 points, 12 points, 10 points, so on and so forth. Points are smaller distances that are generally measured, such as paragraph indents, lines, rules, letter spacing, and type sizes are all measured in points. Picas might be something you haven't heard before. Picas are generally used to measure page elements and dimensions such as column widths and page margins. And you're very familiar with, obviously, inches. So 6 picas equals 1 inch, 12 points equal 1 pica, and 72 points equal 1 inch. You'll see when we go on to our weekly checklist for this week, we are going to be ordering this week a type gauge ruler. So notice this type gauge ruler. I have a photo of it up on our checklist this week. This is translucent, and it's translucent so that we can see type behind it and measure the type. And this measurement comes with points and picas. And next week, we're going to be learning how to measure using a type gauge ruler. So for next week, you're all going to need to pick one of these up and have it in hand for next week's class. And this can be ordered on Amazon. You can go to Blick. I believe the bookstore has it, but I'm not 100% sure. But this information about this is in our checklist for this week. But this is just a little hint that we're moving into measuring and learning about measurements, and therefore you need a new ruler, and this ruler is a type gauge ruler. Okay, a couple things that I think you know already, and that is what is sans serif on the left and serif is on the right. A serif are these little feet that are at the bottom base and the edges of the typefaces. When it's sans serif, that means there are no serifs. There's no extrusions coming off the edges. When there are, they're called serifs. The stroke of any line that defines the basic letter form. So when we refer to any element in a letter form, we call it a stroke. In other words, if we had a pen, we would make strokes to draw the letter form. So it's kind of coming from that way we first designed letter forms for printing. We use pen and ink, and that was using anything was created using a stroke, and so that terminology stays. Okay, we've already talked about what a serif is. It's added to the ends of the main strokes of letter forms. And so the space between the serif and the stem of a letter is a bracket. Some serifs have brackets, some don't. This is an example of a letter form with a bracket, which is this little curved element that kind of transitions it from a stem to a serif. Okay, the next line in our scaffolding is a descender. A stroke on a lowercase letter form that falls below the baseline is a descender. And then we also have an ascender, a stroke on a lowercase that rises above the median X height. Bowl, a curved stroke enclosing the counter of a letter. The counter is this enclosed space in the center of a letter, and a bowl is only on enclosed spaces. So what other letter in this word would have a bowl in addition to the G? You can type it into the chat or just turn your mic on. Right, the lowercase d, correct. Okay, this is the counter, a negative space that's fully or partially enclosed by a letter form. A stem is a major vertical or diagonal stroke in the letter form. This is a ligature. It's where two or more characters are linked together as one unit. This is F and I, which is a very common ligature. And to get to access ligatures, typefaces that have ligatures designed are usually old style typefaces. And you have to access the glyph palette to access a ligature. And then it's one character once we do. It's a character from the glyph palette, and it becomes one character, not two anymore. Finial is the rounded non-serif terminal to a stroke. And the word terminal stands for a self-contained finish of a stroke without a serif. Tail is the curved or diagonal stroke at the finish of certain terminals. Q is one of the few letters that have a tail. Cross stroke are horizontal strokes that intersect the stem. So think lowercase t, lowercase f, have cross strokes. And the key word here is intersect. Spur is the extension that articulates the meeting of a curved and rectilinear stroke. Shoulder is the curved stroke that is not a bowl. So in other words, When we have an opening, it's not fully enclosed, it's a shoulder. I also want to point out that we're starting to use some more humanistic terms, right? So we all have shoulders. The N and M have shoulders. The lowercase g has an ear stroke ending out of the main stem or body of the letter form. The only letter that has an ear is a lowercase g. So continuing on with our humanistic terms, can anyone tell me and take a wild guess what we would call the upper strokes, either diagonal or horizontal, of a letter form? What would we call them? Jessica, you're right, arms. So then if those are arms, what would this be? Legs, exactly. Legs are short strokes off the letter form, either at the bottom or inclining downwards. Okay, we have a crossbar on an A that's a horizontal stroke that joins two stems. Who could tell me what other letter will have a crossbar besides an A? H, exactly. Okay, the A and the V have apex and vertex, the point created by joining two diagonal stems. Apex, like a mountain, is on the top of the A, and vertex, like a valley, is on the bottom of the V. The space between two diagonal strokes is a crotch. Now, letter O has a stress, and that is the gradual variation in the thickness of a curved character, part, or stroke. So not every O has a stress. So for example, you see one here without one. It is a geometric O from Futura that does not have a stress, and it's because the stroke is entirely consistent all the way around. There is no thin to thick variation. The only time there's a stress is if there's a thin to thick variation. Modern text has vertical stress. Old style type has a diagonal stress. I'm hearing someone. I might want to have you, if you have your, make sure you're muted if you are hearing something. All right, classification. So that's it for anatomy here. Now I want to remind you, I've given you multiple readings on anatomy in our readings this week for you to review. There are more anatomies than I've given you here in this lecture. There are more for you to learn. So this is kind of an overview of the most common ones, but there are some more to be learned that I did not include in this lecture. So make sure you've read through the examples I've given you. Okay, next we're going to move into classifications. Typefaces, think of it very much like, just like we have breeds of dogs, right? We have classifications of type. And so type falls into different categories. We've learned about a lot of them this week when we learned about the history of typefaces. And it's usually based on the era that they were designed. And we need a way to sort and organize, right? Now, classifications, there are books that are like encyclopedia thick that would give you every kind of classification there is. Because this is an introduction to typography, we are not going to be hitting every kind of classification there is. I'm going to be giving you the top 5, and it's the same top 5 that Ellen Lupton has in her book that you're reading. So here we go. Old style is the first one we've learned about. We're using Garamond as our example, which was designed in 1475. Remember, these are the capitals that were influenced by carved Roman capitals. These were, carved in stone. It emulates classic calligraphy The weight of the stress of the rounded forms is at an angle, as in handwriting. And the italic versions of these feel like calligraphy. They feel very calligraphic. The serifs are bracketed, meaning they have these nice curves around on each side of them. The top serifs are at an angle, and it's very human-like. Modern has the extreme contrast between thick and thin strokes. We're using the example of Bodoni, designed in 1798. And Bodoni took its clue from Baskerville, who was, again, if we remember, was accused of blinding people with the extreme contrast between thick and thin strokes. Bodoni went a step further and tried to make it even more contrasted, and then it went on to Didot and so on and so forth. So the more mechanical, the less calligraphic. The serifs are, for the most part, unbracketed. The weight of the stress of the rounded characters is vertical, and there's thin, straight serifs. We then move into the industrial age and the need for monster fonts, and that's when we came up with the Egyptian, or AKA slab serifs. Clarendon is the example I'm using here, which was designed in 1845. They're heavy square or rectangular serifs, minimal stress of the curved strokes. Some have strokes that are the same weight. Some are unbracketed, but they all have these big, beefy serifs. They're used for advertising. They're used to advertise and make billboards and be big and bold and call a lot of attention to themselves. Then we move into the Roaring 20s, and we have the introduction of geometric sans. Futura, which was born in 1927, has no serifs. The O's are perfect circles. The A's and M's have sharp peaks, and if we put a line at the bottom of the A, it would create a perfect triangle. They're very geometric, rhythmic, clean. And Futura is the first typeface that landed on the moon. Now we're moving into mid-century. Universe is the example here, 1954. It's a transitional sans. There's no serifs. Anonymous or neutral. It's very rational. There's a uniform stroke. The stress is almost always vertical. It's the look of mid-century business, and many identities were made in typefaces like Universe and Helvetica, who both fall into this category. All right, and that is the end of our categories that we're going to go over this semester.